So this video is actually long overdue. This is a video about the very first training that I put together for the department, and that was on why I think trigger reset is garbage. If you were at the training, that probably already makes sense. You remember why. You remember some of the things that we've talked about. It's a bad habit that doesn't really help us be a better shooter. In fact, when we're on the line and we fire the course of fire, and then we finish with our 2 shots, I'll get another shot in there, what typically do we do with our trigger finger? It typically stays pinned to the rear. Why? Because we told ourselves we were only going to fire 2 shots. And so then after the target goes away, we can then hear and feel that audible click. Now that happens a lot on the qual range, especially at distance when we get back to the 15 and 20 yard line. I pointed that out to you, and a lot of you shook your head and like, yeah, I recognize that I'm doing that. For those of you who haven't been to the training or didn't see that training and are relying on this video, pay attention to what you do next time you're on the range. I remember catching myself on the range after course of fire and saying, oh yeah, I got it 100%, way to go, Brett, pat myself on the back, and then realize, why am I holding my trigger to the rear? Looking around and kind of thinking, this is stupid. Why would I do that? But it wasn't my practice. It wasn't something I'd ever trained to not do because I have been trained in trigger reset. So instead of fixing the problem, I would try and mask the problem. I'd look around, I'd make some noise as I reset that trigger. This is the same concept, if not just a very slight variation on the same game I had played during the actual rolling trigger training. Here the volunteers are racing to be the first one to complete the course. The course to hit the wall, then to hit that table, then to hit the close bucket, and then to hit the far bucket. They are not allowed to throw their item until they cross that bar, and they must return to these stairs and touch the stairs to retrieve the item after each throw. After they were done, it was explained that this game is an analogy of shooting. So let's debrief that game they were playing. What happens is, when they start running, that is the equivalent of them grabbing the gun and putting their finger on the trigger. They now have an object in their hand that they're going to throw. That's a bullet in the chamber. As they run forward, that's the equivalent of them taking the slack out of the trigger. And when they get all the slack out, that's the equivalent of them getting across that bar. At that moment in time, they could break the shot, right? And depending on how easy that shot is how fast they do it. On the first throw, all they had to hit was the wall. So as soon as they jumped across that bar, you saw them just throwing the toy and turning around and running back. Now, at what speed did they run back? They did that as fast as they could in order to win. So what is the equivalent of our running back? Our running back is getting our trigger prepped and ready again. Why would I want to do it at this speed when I could do it at this speed? If I do it at that speed, that gets me ready to make the next shot. And as far as that game goes, how fast they ran back and picked up the toy and got back across the bar had no bearing on whether or not they were able to make the next shot, except maybe they got too winded because they were running too fast. Just like this has no bearing on my next shot. That had no bearing on my shot. In fact, watch my muzzle moving around as I'm doing this. None of that had any bearing on this. That was completely by itself. So the degree of difficulty that they were faced in the game, i.e. whether they had to hit the entire wall or they had to hit that table or they had to hit one of those smaller buckets out on the floor, that's what determined how fast they actually squeezed the trigger to ignition. That was them actually having their sights aligned. And again, the degree of difficulty of the shot is going to change how fast I can pull the trigger. If I'm trying to take a 25-yard headshot, then that is not going to be an effective trigger press. But if I am shooting at somebody at contact range and I draw and just punch out and they're, let's say, 3 feet in front of me, I can jerk the gun out and pull the trigger, and guess what? I know that I'll be able to get a body shot at 3 yards. And I know most of you are going to be able to do that as well. So I'm about to show you some slow-mo videos that I shot a long time ago. When I shot these videos back probably 5-6 years ago, so 2014, 2015, somewhere in there, I didn't tell the shooters what I was filming. I just told them that I needed them to shoot 10 rounds on a piece of steel at 10 yards as fast as possible. I had my clipboard out, I was making notes, and I had my shot timer, and I told them that they couldn't miss, but I didn't tell them what the whole game was. And what I was doing was just watching the trigger finger. I just wanted to see what kind of movement I saw. So I used SWAT guys, I used firearms instructors, and these guys have all been trained in the trigger reset mentality. What I saw was a couple things, but the first thing I want to talk about that really caught me off guard is as they were going through the drill and they were shooting the gun and they were resetting the trigger, if they ever did this and had a failed reset, 100% of the time they all did this. They all came completely off the trigger. They actually let go of the trigger. I could see gap, or I could see that trigger came all the way forward and maybe the finger was still touching, but for the most part, that finger came all the way off. Why did they do this? Because they recognized in that split second that they hadn't reset the trigger, and so the body's natural reaction was to overcorrect, was to come all the way off. Now, under my rough draft of this training outline and lesson I put together, I had a naysayer. I had a person who'd been shooting for a long time. He said, Brett, I guarantee I'm faster with a small movement and being able to fire that. I guarantee that with my muscle memory and with my ability to reset that trigger so quickly, that I'm going to be faster doing the trigger reset method than the rolling trigger method that I was trying to explain. And so that's where I found the second thing very interesting. I didn't even recognize it when I first made the videos and when I watched them in slow-mo, but every single person, myself included, would shoot. The gun would be in recoil, and then they would settle their sights back onto the target. And once the sights were settled on the target, that is when you would see the finger actually start to creep forward. So what I found is that on a plate rack where there were 6 targets, I would shoot, and then I would transfer targets, and then I would begin the act of doing a trigger reset. It was physically impossible for me to do a slow reset while I was in recoil. It wasn't that we can be faster doing trigger reset, it's that we've got time to do something where currently we're not. So right now, if I were to jump off the trigger and then it were to recoil forward and then I touch the trigger, would I be faster or slower? Well, I think I could be faster. And in watching the video that you're about to watch, I think you're going to see the same thing. What happened is in recoil, while the gun was in the air and my sights were off the target, my finger came off and came back on the trigger and had it prepped before I broke the next shot. It's important to note that both methods of shooting, when I did the trigger reset and when I did the rolling trigger, both methods, I went as fast as I could. And I also went 6 for 6 out of my hits on that steel rack. I didn't allow any video to make it in there where there was that kind of anomaly where there was a miss and we were looking at the mechanics of the miss. So watch these videos and pay attention to when the finger is actually doing its work. let's talk about what actually makes us a good shooter. What makes us a good shooter is our ability to pull the trigger to the rear and not move our sights around. Our ability to hold on to that gun and have a good grip, and so that when we squeeze with our trigger finger, we don't input any side to side or up and down movement on the gun. We all know what this is, and that anticipation. Also, I've talked to a lot of people about when we pull the trigger quickly, if we were to break my wrist, let me move over here, if I just break my wrist like this and pull the trigger as fast as I can, you're going to see my wrist is going to start creeping forward. Why? It's because my body wants skeletal alignment. So I can be skeletally aligned right here until I put a gun in my hand. And now I'm actually broken just sideways just a little bit. It's kind of hard to see in the video. But what I can do is get skeletal alignment with my support side hand. So if I have my support side hand straight, then I have the ability to keep that gun from moving to the side as I'm pulling trigger. A lot of times we let our support side hand just kind of float there and we squeeze the trigger, and maybe I am turning my wrist as I squeeze the trigger because my body's craving that skeletal alignment. It's kind of hard to make a fist here, it's easier to make a fist here. So the first thing or not the first thing, but what we need to make sure that we address is, I don't want you to miss. I want you to be accurate. And the only things that are going to affect your accuracy are your ability to line up your sights, and then your ability to press the trigger to the rear without inputting those sights side to side, up or down as you're doing that press. Now let's talk about the drill. I'm going to pull the trigger, and I'm going to pull it slowly. I'm going to make it a difficult shot so that I have to pull the trigger slow, because anybody can go fast both ways. I want to have a slow press, boom, and on the ignition, boom. I'm going to throw my finger completely off the trigger, completely out of the trigger well. So it looks like this, boom, and I'm throwing my finger off, boom, or ignition. As soon as that gun fires, I am throwing my finger all the way out of the trigger well and off the trigger. Now, I'm not advocating that that's what we do forever, but that is how we overemphasize and exaggerate this drill to make sure that we are able to progress. So when people first saw Evolution 1 on what I wanted them to do, a lot of people were shaking their heads and scratching their heads like, this is stupid, Brett's lost his mind. Because of course that's going to have a negative impact on my shots. What I want to go over is just some numbers, okay, some math that I got from good old Google. So according to Google, the average human reaction time for a visual stimulus is 0.25 seconds. Our ability to react to an audio stimulus, I'm not sure, whatever, to an ear hole stimulus is 0.17 seconds. And then the fastest way we can react to something, according to Google, is by touch or a tactile sensation in 0.15 seconds. So now let's talk about the muzzle velocity of a 9mm. It's right around 1,200 feet per second, give or take the barrel length, give or take the ammo, but we're going to round down to 1,000. We're going to say that the muzzle velocity is 1,000 feet per second. Now, if I am going off of tactile, and I'm going off of, well, let's back up. Let's go off visual. If I am able to just stare at my gun and look at it and wait for that for that trigger to break, and I can actually see the flame spit out of the gun, I can see the trigger break, how far would that bullet have traveled before I am able to react and throw my finger off the trigger and shake my gun? In 0.25 seconds, that bullet's traveled, what? About 250 feet. So if I am watching for the ignition to occur, I'm watching for the explosion to happen and for the bullet to be sent downrange, even if I shake the gun as I throw my finger off the trigger, and that's going to make sense in a second, that bullet's already 250 feet downrange. Okay, now let's go by touch. So by touch was 0.17 seconds, but again, to make it easier for math, let's go 1.25 seconds. So we're going to take that visual stimulus and we're going to cut it in half. So if I am just going by touch, when I hear or when I feel the gun go boom, and then I throw my finger off the trigger, how far has that bullet traveled? Well, exactly half of 250 feet, so 120 feet, 125 feet. So if I am trying to do this drill, is there going to be any chance that any movement I have of the gun or of my trigger finger after ignition occurs, is there any chance that that is going to impact the accuracy of that round fired? None at all. That bullet's already downrange. In fact, if we're shooting at a paper target at 15 yards, we're well within that range. So by the time I can feel the gun fire, for me to do this drill, that bullet's already gonna have struck the paper. So if you're at the range, I would like you to have shot about 10, 15 rounds, throwing your finger completely out after every time you pull the trigger, after every ignition. Now, our next evolution is to do this. Boom, we're gonna jump our finger off, but we're gonna stay inside the trigger well. Boom, I'm jumping off as fast as I can. Boom, okay? I am losing contact with my trigger, but I'm staying inside the well as fast as possible. It's kind of hard to simulate this here, but you'll find that as you're shooting, if you are actually pulling the trigger slow, jumping off is going to be difficult. And the reason is because we don't have the neural connection between our brain and our trigger finger that we need to be able to communicate slow, fast, slow, fast. So that's what we're trying to build right now. So after another 10, 15 rounds doing that jumping off but staying inside the trigger well, our next evolution is going to be this. We're going to boom, we're going to get ignition, we're going to jump off, and then we're simply going to touch the trigger. I'm not taking out any slack, I'm just touch. Boom, off touch, as fast as I can. Boom, off touch, as fast as possible. Now, if you are doing this and you accidentally come off and break the trigger, then pay attention to what you do. What does your finger do? Most people, in fact, I'd say 90+% of the people that I watched and trained, when they had that accidental second shot, it's not an AD because this is training, but when they had that accidental shot, they did this. They kept their finger pinned to the rear. Like, oh man, I just shot twice. I was only supposed to shoot once. This is proof positive that they weren't neurally connected and that their trigger finger was still being a little simple and slow. It didn't know that it was supposed to jump off, even though that's what they were doing. Instead, they sat there with a trigger pinned to the rear as if it was the gun's fault and it was their trigger's fault. The next evolution is almost guaranteed to make you have a double tap. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to boom, break the trigger. We're going to jump off. We're going to touch, and we're going to take up the slack as fast as possible. So it's not off and crack the trigger again. It's boom, off, touch, slack, and then pause as fast as possible. I'm going to stay in this pause position for about 2 seconds. And then after I've stayed here for 2 seconds, I'm going to make the conscious decision to go ahead and pull the trigger again. When I pull the trigger again, boom, I jump off, I'm going to touch, and I'm going to take out the slack. I'm going to do all that as fast as possible. Now, there's a very good chance that you're going to do this. Boom, off touch slack, and you're going to break the trigger. Again, it's not an AD. It's an opportunity to train. What do you do after you break the trigger that second time? Do you off touch slack again, or do you stay pinned to the rear? If you stay pinned to the rear, you're still not quite getting it. If you get off and you get the slack out after touching it, then you are on your way to actually getting this rolling trigger method down. Now, every mode that we've done, we have lost contact with the trigger. That is not my end goal for you. That is not what I think you ought to be doing. What I want you to do is to be able to do this, boom. So, did I lose contact with the trigger? I don't think so. I know I didn't on that one. Boom. Boom. I know I didn't on that one. So I'm teaching my finger to go fast and go slow and go fast. I'm teaching it to go in different speeds. And the more I practice this, the better I'll be able to accomplish this. The faster I'll pull the trigger and the less likely that I'm ever going to get trigger freeze. We stop worrying about what our sights are doing, what our gun is doing at this phase, and we can start instead focusing on what our gun is doing and what our trigger finger is doing in this phase. We can make ourselves much better shooters. Only one thing matters in a gunfight, and that's winning. And only two things directly influence that. The first is speed, the second is accuracy. So we can talk about accuracy, slow press, not moving the sights. How do we get faster? This is how we get faster. We get faster at re-prepping the trigger so that we are better and more quickly ready to take a follow-up shot. Every time I pull the trigger, I should have a trigger prep. that immediately follows it. I should not pull the trigger and then sit there and evaluate whether or not this bad guy needs another bullet. I should be prepped and ready in case that bad guy pulls the gun. I don't want to be caught when the moment is crucial. I don't want to be caught like this. I don't want to be caught with my finger pinned to the rear. And if I'm in a gunfight where speed and accuracy matter, I want to be as fast as possible while still being accurate. I guarantee I can be faster at pulling the trigger with this rolling trigger method than I can with the trigger reset method. So I just went over the different steps that you can take on the range under live fire. How do I practice this dry? Well, the first thing I'm going to do when I go home and I'm practicing dry is I'm going to practice my draw strokes. I want to practice my draw strokes because that's very, very important. I'm still going to do some dry firing as well, but I'm going to recognize this, that this is where the dry firing stops being real. When I have to bring the gun back and cycle it, and if I am doing what I was taught in post, I am then doing what? I am then doing a slow creep before I pull the trigger again. That's not what I want you to do. I want you to do dry draw strokes, and I want you to get your sights on target and get a good, slow, smooth trigger press, breaking the trigger. But when it comes to practicing this dry at home, here's how I want you to do it. I want you to just go ahead and pull the trigger and break it. Then I want you to go ahead and cycle the action. Now I want you to point the gun at your TV or at the wall or whatever, and as you're watching TV or listening to your music, you're waiting for some sort of audio stimulus or ear hole stimulus. Okay, so as soon as the character on the left opens their mouth and says something, what am I going to do? That's going to be my ignition. As soon as they talk, I jump forward and I re-prep the trigger. And that is how I get that practice. Now I can go ahead and put it back in my holster, do another draw stroke, sight alignment, sight picture, press, perfect. Now I'm ready for my next evolution. Waiting, now. And I've got the trigger re-prepped. That's how I'm going to do this dry. That's how I want you to do this dry.